Hi, Kevin Tharp here. Today we're going to be talking about web systems. Anytime you are dealing with a computer, you are dealing with some kind of system, and really you're dealing with a system of systems. And so what we're going to talk about today particularly is web systems, because you'll need to understand how these systems work together in order to understand why we do some of the things that we do when we are doing web development, web design. So the first thing that we need to understand is that the World Wide Web works on a system that's called a client server. Actually, the internet does, not just the World Wide Web. All of the parts of the internet use what's called a client server model. And what that client server model does is you have got a computer that is local to the end user. That would be the client computer. And that'll be the laptop or desktop or whatever you are using to access the internet. And the kinds of things that you're going to find on a client machine are elements like a browser. Your web browser is the one. Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, whatever web browser you're using. That's part of the client system. The FTP client, if you happen to be planning on publishing files to the web, websites to the web, there's a good chance that you're going to use an FTP client. For instance, when I teach web development, we use this Dreamweaver software, and built into that Dreamweaver software is an FTP client that allows that software to use the file transfer protocol. That's what FTP stands for, and that's for moving files from one location to the other on the internet. And so it has the FTP client in there. The other thing is your mail client. When you're using your mail program, you are using a mail client. And client means that it's software that sits locally, and it is querying a server, which brings us to the next element. And that server is the computers on the other end of the internet that you are making requests from. So in the client server model, what happens is the client computer makes a request using a browser or an FTP client or a mail client or other client software that you might have. And what it does is it makes a request to the server. That's either to get information or to send information to that server. Now, it's not really just a server. It's a system of servers that are put up together. The first one, when you're using the web, is normally an HTTP server. So when you look at a URL and you see http://www.kevinwtharp.com, what you're looking at is going to an HTTP server, Hypertext Transfer Protocol server. And what that's going to do is that's actually sort of a front-end server. It handles some requests, but it also interacts with a series of other servers depending upon what you're trying to do. So that is the location that you make your initial request to. Then, depending upon the way that the page that you're requesting is made up, it may have to then pull additional information from a database server, from a script server, or from a media server. And what it does is it then pulls the HTTP server then pulls those documents together and sends those back to the client. And the client, which we'll just use the browser for simplicity, the browser puts those back together and renders them in the way that we see in what looks like a web page. So the way that this works is there's a thing called TCP/IP, and actually TCP/IP is two different protocols. The first is Transmission Control Protocol, and that controls the ability to move things back and forth. If you're a network person, you're going to be very familiar with this, because what this is the set of rules that allows you to take a large piece of information and break it down into bits and bytes and packets and sends them as little groups of lots of groups of a little bit of information back and forth so that they can be assembled and reassembled in remote locations. The other is Internet Protocol, which is the system of assigning addresses and addresses to different locations and the protocol for moving that. So we've got the clients on the one side using a TCP/IP request that goes to, if it's an HTTP:// a URL, that begins with HTTP. It goes to an HTTP server. That also might be a secure HTTP server, which is a HTTPS server. And then that, depending upon what you're requesting, may pull from a number of different locations to put that together. But we need to understand that there are humans in this equation too. And so what we have here is, along with the IP system, we've got a DNS, or domain name server system. And what the DNS system does is it recognizes that humans are really not capable of remembering a huge series of IP addresses. IP addresses take the form of something like this, where you have a series of numbers there that are part of the Internet Protocol. And what those do is they give every device that is on the Internet a address that is in the form of numbers that can be looked up and routed to, and generally information can go to them and from them, because that allows the different routers and servers that are on the Internet to know where to send that information. But because there is a human factor in that, it's a lot easier for me to remember kevinwtharp.com than whatever the IP address of that is. What we've got is a DNS system, a domain name server system that allows us to associate that IP address with a domain. And a domain is the parts of the URL that come before the last dot. So I might have kevinwtharp.com, kevinwtharp.net, kevinwtharp.org, etc., etc., etc. And all of those would be independent of each other, but what that allows me to do is to have a human recognizable piece of information that can be served back. So the first time I make a request to an HTTP server, if my client does not know where to find that HTTP server, the first thing that it does is it sends out the request, it goes to a DNS server, and that DNS server sends back the IP address to the client so that it is able to then route through the Internet to get to that HTTP server. So this number would actually belong to this HTTP client, or to this HTTP server. And then that allows us to go ahead and interact with that client-server protocol that we are talking about. So when we do that, the first thing that we're going to normally encounter with an HTTP server, and I'm going to simplify this to assume that everything at this point is just coming off of the HTTP server. It's not pulling anything off of a remote location. So I've made the request to the server, and technically you wouldn't do that with the FTP or mail client, so those shouldn't be there. So again, we're working with the browser here. But that comes, and in the HTTP server there is a file system. What that file system is the way that information is organized into the particular website that you are using. Now, there may be a number of different websites on the same HTTP server, and most often that is the case. So this is simplifying it to look at one individual website within an HTTP server. But so the HTTP server would have its own file system with a series of websites, but we're not going to go into that. We're just going to look at an individual one. So when I have a website set up on a server, I've got the root directory, which is indicated by the /, and then within that I've got the ability to have files, folders, subfolders, and within each of the folders there are the ability to have files. And that's the basic makeup of a file system. And what a file system does is it simply allows us to organize the information that we want to present so that, for instance, you don't have 1,000 files in a single directory. When I use the term folders, I also mean directories, so I may use those interminglably. So folders or files are not folders or directories mean the same thing. Files are not folders, and folders are not files. However, folders can contain files. Files can only contain information, but folders can contain files. So the way that you see this is we've got the root directory, and then inside that there's going to be a file, and there needs to be a default file, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then there can be a folder with, again, a default file, with a default file, and a subfolder with default files in them. And you need to get in the habit of using the default file names that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. But what that allows us to do is essentially make kind of a structure out of your content that allows it to have nested layers, so layers inside of layers, or directories inside of directories, so that you can organize and further organize your information. What this allows us to do is we have what's called absolute path. And now an absolute URL or an absolute path is the entire address of a particular file, because that's what you're pulling up when you are going to when you're making a request from a client to a server. You are pulling up an individual file. So in this case, if I was going to kevinwtharp.com and I wanted to load this file in place, this one right here, then what I would be looking at is how do I get to that file. And let's colorize that so you can see it. So I want to get to this file. Well, using an absolute URL, you can get to that particular file from any location that has access to the internet, as long as you've got the DNS set up and all the other protocols working right. So the way that we would look at this is it would go to kevinwtharp.com, which is going to the proper location in the HTTP folder, and actually it is bringing me to this root location. So if I just entered kevinwtharp.com, it would start looking in this root location. Okay, and so then if I wanted to get down to this file about phishing under hobbies, then what this does is it becomes a path, and you need to have the entire path correct in order to get there. So I would have kevinwtharp.com/hobbies/phishing, and what that's doing is it's saying inside of kevinwtharp.com, inside the root folder, look for another folder called hobbies, and then inside of the hobbies folder, look for a folder called phishing. Oops. And within that phishing folder, look for the file called index.html. And what that is an absolute path. That is going to get me to that location as long as it exists on the internet and my computer is set up to go and take care of that. So that's an absolute path. Those can be quite long, especially when you're designing your own site. So what I've got here is we were talking about the default files, and that's what we're going to talk about here. You'll notice that I've added file names in here, and you'll notice that in the phishing there's index.html, in the root there's index.html, and inside of the hobbies there's index.html. With the server that we use for our class, index.html is the default file name. And what that default file name is doing is when it goes to an absolute URL, if you give it the file name, it's going to find that. But if you fail to give it that file name, so if I just entered kevinwtharp.com/hobby/phishing, what it's going to do is it's going to start looking for that default file name. And that default file name is often index.html. So when it gets to this phishing folder and it isn't told the specific file name to look for, what it looks for is that default file name index.html. And that allows me to shorten the URLs when I'm going to the first file in a folder, so that I just have to list the folder name. So that this URL is the same as this URL, even though I don't list that, because the search engine, not the search engine, the HTTP server is going to look for that index file and serve that up when it comes to that. So that's why we use the default files. Okay, so those are absolute paths. Now we're talking about relative paths. And again, let's take from the idea that we are at the or trying to get to index.html. So from anywhere in my site, if I want to use a relative URL, what I need to do is I need to have a path that will get it there. Now in this case, let's say that I was at the hobbies index.html or some other file somewhere in the file system if it is more complicated. Using a URL, you see the dot there, that means to go up to the root. So you get their dot there, and then you go to hobbies and then fishing, and of course it will pull up the index.html. And so from anywhere in my site, when I'm designing, I can enter that URL and it will get me there without having to go out to the client, the domain name server system or anything like that. It'll allow me to just look within my existing site. So if I were at fishing, in the fishing folder, and I wanted to go to load this bigfish.html, because it's in the same folder as the index file that I'm looking at, all I have to type is the file name, because it knows that it does not have to navigate through the directory structure to get there. So relative URLs allow you to navigate through the existing site, through the folder structure, or within the same folder, depending upon how you format that particular HTTP request. So now when we're looking at file types within the web system, within the HTTP server, there's a number of different kinds of files that you can use. If you recall what I said, when the browser is rendering a page, it pulls from a number of different kinds of content. So within the file system, it's important to understand this. There's different file types that you can have. Obviously, you have folders. Your root is actually a folder that is indicated by the /. You can have files such as index.html, and there's different types of files that you can have. You might have CSS documents, and the reason I have a folder indicated here is it's good practice to put your CSS documents all in the same folder, depending upon how you're organizing your site. But you might have documents. Documents might include Excel documents. It might include Word documents. It might include PDFs. PDFs are a real common form. So you can have documents in there. You can have images. On the web, the accepted image types that are going to be available to all the browsers are JPEG, GIF, .gif, and ping.png, and those are the three standard image types that we use. Scripts are going to depend upon what you've got. JavaScript is a common way that you will see that, and you'll see folders if you're using JavaScript that are called /JS, and that is where the JavaScripts will be held. And then you've got other media that might include a SWF file, which is a flash file. It might include videos. It might include audio. So you might have an MP3 or you might have an MP4. So there's all different kinds of media that can be in there, and those will live either in the file system or, depending upon how you've got it set up, they might live on one of these other types of servers that are out there. For instance, if I was running PHP, that would when I made a request that was PHP, it'd go to a script server. If I had a media server and I was wanting to stream a video, it would go to the media server. For instance, when I often run YouTube videos on my website. In fact, you're watching one right now. And that's coming from YouTube's media server. I happen to use theirs. And then, of course, database servers. So we've got the file system that is internal to the HTTP server. We've got all these other types of servers that we can pull from. And each of those are going to have a file system as well. And so when we have a browser make a HTTP request, that HTTP request, the server is going to look at all the different parts that make up that. It might include a file, it might include an image, it might include scripts, It might include data from or information from other servers outside of that HTTP server. And what the HTTP server does is it brings all that stuff together and it sends it back to the client. And what the client does is it will then use the browser to put all that back together, and that's what you end up looking at when you are looking at a web page, is the browser taking all the different files that are necessary to make up the page that you're looking at, bringing them back, and then through a process called rendering, which is based upon the standards of how you put these things back together. It puts them back together, and then it displays it on your screen. So now that we're actually talking about publishing, we bring a little bit different equation into this, in that you don't work when you are publishing. You generally do not work on the remote server when you are doing your design work. You wait until you're ready to test it or serve it to the public to put it out on this server. So normally on your client machine, you are going to have a file system that is going to be identical or close to the file system that represents the main content of your website. So you're going to have a file, a directory set aside in your server that will serve as the root, and inside of that you will build the folders that will later be transferred into the HTTP server's file system at your root location. And so the important thing to understand about this is when you are working on a client, you need to make sure that any files that you're going to be using as part of your web system live inside of this root directory. Because if you are sending out requests that say file : / and then give a path to somewhere on your laptop, they're not going to be able to find that when people go to the HTTP server and they're looking for that. What it would have them do is look on their local machine for that file, rather than using the absolute or relative URLs where it's either a full path to that document or a path relative to that document from wherever you're at in the site. So all your images need to live within this root folder. Any scripts that you're using, any artifacts that you're using as part of your website need to live within this file system on your client, so that when you synchronize that up or FTP it up or whatever protocol you use to move that information from your client machine to the server machine. And again, this is where your Dreamweaver is going to serve if you're using Dreamweaver or whatever software you're using. If it builds in that ability to do the FTP with the software, it's going to keep track of this locally and remotely and allow you to move the files so that you can fully execute what you're trying to do when somebody comes to visit your site. That's all I have about that for now.